So, we all care about morality, right? We care about the rightness of what we do and the rightness of what is done and done in our name. You'd be forgiven, though, for thinking otherwise. Thanks to the relatively young discipline of economics, and I didn't invite anybody from that discipline this evening, self-interest has become the dominant explanation of every human motivation and action, indeed the very spirit of our nature as humans. But this is despite the fact that so much of what we do as human beings, individually and collectively, is patently other-oriented in its intention, motivation, and consequence. Your decision to do all of the following suggests the truth of this, so I'm just going to give you a few examples. Have children, or think about having children, and to sacrifice materially, socially, and emotionally for them. So is it something that's all about patent self-interest? Or to give up your job, say some of you might have done that, to look after a helpless and indigent parent. What about people who, in the audience, who've assisted a stranger who's being physically or mentally assaulted on a bus or a train at risk to your own safety? Anybody done that? Or have you bought a remembrance poppy or a red nose? Have you donated or signed a petition or done even more to protect animals being slaughtered on distant shores, say, or some other good cause? You've made a decision to be here tonight. So it seems to me that it's quite clear that people do want to do the right thing, but what is tricky is knowing what the right thing is. To find out, we must do some parsing. We need to crack open the concept of the good deed and explore its parts. Can these different parts be mixed and matched, or is there only one thing, perhaps, that's common to everything that we label as moral? Does a good deed, for instance, require the right motivation or reason? If you donate money to a disaster appeal because you feel compassion for the victims, but that money is used to buy useless or inappropriate goods, have you still done the right thing? Or does that fact, the outcome of what happened, make it wrong? Certainly the quote that gave tonight's forum the title suggests that maybe you have. Where do intentions fit in? Is it right for government bureaucrats concerned about vulnerable migrants being exploited to crack down on black market jobs, even when it denies those with no other option a desperately needed source of income? Or is it the consequence of actions, whatever the intention or motive for them, that separates moral from immoral deeds? The justifications given by the Coalition of the Willing, of which Australia was a part for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, was a movable feast. In the mix were that Iraq had WMDs, which turned out to be false. Iraq's role in the bombing of the World Trade Towers was claimed to be one of the reasons that we went in. That turned out to be false. The cruelty and oppression by Saddam Hussein of his own people, which arguably was true. But the real test of whether we behave morally is whether the war succeeded in getting rid of a dictator and improving the lives of the Iraqi people, right? Certainly this is the line spoken by Thomas A. Becket in T.S. Eliot's play Murder in the Cathedral, that idea that the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. If consequence is all that matters, it must mean that Joseph Stalin's 1940 decision to ship 200 to 250,000 Polish Jews to the Gulag, which he did because he was an anti-Semite who wanted such educated upper-middle-class folk out of the way, was a good thing. Why? Well, because it ended up having a really good consequence. The consequence was that when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Jews were routinely rounded up and murdered, but those who were safe in the Gulag didn't actually share this fate. So did he do a good thing? Because the consequence was good? The Second World War produced a cornucopia of moral quandaries. The bombing of civilian populations with conventional and nuclear bombs, Allied and Axis, as a technique to expedite the end of the war raises disturbing questions about means and ends. Surely it's right to pursue a quick finish to a miserable war. But does that mean it's morally acceptable, or at least morally forgivable, to target civilians to achieve that end? And this is a really personal story for me, because I discovered only a few years ago that my grandfather, who fought in every theatre in the Second World War, all the major battles he was involved in, he was very supportive of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I was quite surprised about. And he told me that the reason was because it brought the war to an end and he was pretty sure it saved his life. And he told me that I basically wouldn't have had my aunt and my uncle if he hadn't come home. So it raises really interesting questions. What about the good-hearted, well-meaning folk who are among those who sought to breed out the black by forcibly removing Aboriginal children from their parents and culture, or who coerced unmarried mothers into relinquishing their children for adoption? Do those who truly meant well still have much to answer for? And even if we say, yes, they do we do them any justice by imposing contemporary judgments on those who lived in a different era where different values prevailed? We will also tonight wonder aloud about whether the exercise of political power is compatible with ordinary integrity. How can it be not when politicians must, with few exceptions, subordinate their individual consciences to party discipline? And this is something that I've seen myself because I often am, in Canberra trying to advocate for one thing or another. I've actually seen politicians come into the floor of the Senate or the House to vote, and the whip just tells them which direction to go in. And I've been told that most of them don't even know what they're voting on. So how can you actually have any sort of political integrity when that's going on? But that's party discipline, that's what they have to do. So we care about the rightness of what we do and the rightness of what is done and done in our name. But how can we judge? And should we even dare to do so in such a morally messy world? So with me to sort through these complex questions, and I'm going to ask them to come up as I read their biographies. First of all is Maria Tamarkin. Maria, can you come up and take your seat? Maria is an author and a cultural historian. Her books and essays explore questions of trauma, identity, memory, and moral courage. She holds a PhD in cultural history from the University of Melbourne and is a 2013-14 Sidney Myer Creative Fellow. Can we give her a bit of a clap? Make her welcome. Welcome, Maria. We also have Jane Josem. Jane has a Master's in Public History from Monash University and is currently the Curator and Head of Collections at the Jewish Holocaust Centre. And finally, but certainly not last, we have Professor Tony Coady. Professor Tony Coady is one of Australia's best-known political philosophers. He has an international reputation for his writings on political violence and political ethics. He was the founding director of the Centre for Philosophy and Public Issues at the University of Melbourne, and in 2005, his Uriah Lectures on Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford were published as Messy Morality, The Challenge of Politics, which is an interesting book if people are keen to do some further reading after the night is over.
And quite cheap.
Oh, and completely cheap and affordable as well, I've just been told. Okay, so you all can hear me now? Yep, fantastic. Okay, so I want to start off with all of us, just looking a bit at the historical and contemporary political and personal terrain that provokes some of the questions. The very specific kind of instances where we notice that there's a disconnect and we're wondering if something is right or wrong, depending on the particulars of it. So Maria, you have spoken about what you call the ridiculously inappropriate giving that can happen when a disaster strikes, say like the Melbourne bushfires of 2009. Can you tell us why you're worried about that?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yep. Thank you. To me, giving is such a great example for what we're trying to talk about. It's an ethical minefield in many ways, even though it seems so kind of self-evident. Giving, the impulse to give, the impulse to share something with those in strife, the impulse that is kind of predicated on empathy in the aftermath of disasters, in the aftermath of tragedies, that has to be a good thing, right? Good intentions, how could it lead to bad consequences? So it seems like a no-brainer, but in reality, if you start digging, then your head starts spinning, because to come back to your notion of messy morality, giving is so messy, it's quite unbelievable. So,
how did you start worrying about this? What led you to start worrying about it?
Yeah, a couple of things. And they sort of keep coming at me. For instance, and I'm sure people would have seen something about if you remember this terrible tragedy in Connecticut with the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And I was, you know, a mother of 2 children. I couldn't sleep. I was obsessively reading, following, etc., etc. And then I read a little article, and then it sort of kept coming up about town in the aftermath of that massacre drowning in teddy bears. And people just, you know, being suffocated by teddy bears coming from all parts, not only of the United States, but from, you know, far beyond the United States, to the point that they actually had to ship those teddy bears to India, to other sort of population of children across the world who actually have a genuine need for teddy bears because they were overdosed on teddy bears. And this kind of, you know, it's a sort of a funny and tragic example at the same time, but actually this whole idea of what happens in the aftermath of natural disasters and tragedies is quite well known. And people, if you talk to people who work in those emergency zones, they all talk about inappropriate giving, and they talk about, you know, the kind of masses and masses of goods and sandwiches that have long since expired, and, you know, guitars and toys and warm clothes for tropical climates and all sorts of things that are coming at those sites that are coping already with so much when they're in the aftermath of a natural disaster.
And is the problem that it's making more work for the people who are trying to help?
It's making more work because you have to store it, you have to sort it. If something is going to expire, you have to make it safe. You have to, you often have to basically sort of find a way to dispose of it quietly. Now in the official literature, put out by Emergency Australia and by all sorts of organisations across the world that deal with the aftermath of disasters, they ask people to donate money, they ask people not to give things. You know, roads get clogged up by clothing, this endless sort of, you know, masses of clothing that are coming at people where that is not required. So again, the impulse is very, very good, and yet the consequences are anything but good. And even
this is the reverse of the thing about our topic up there of doing the right thing for the wrong reason. This is a case where people finish up doing the wrong thing for the right reason.
But then
I mean, they have all these good intentions, but they don't anticipate enough just exactly how to gear that to the outcome.
And if you do not anticipate, I mean, do you have the ethical obligation to think about the consequences of your charitable impulses?
Yes,
I mean, do you actually have to think about what's going to happen?
I was just wondering that myself. I mean, do we want to forgive them quite so easily, or do we want to suggest that part of your obligation to give is to actually do a little bit of thinking, which we think about when we give gifts normally to people, don't we? You know, we feel like you ought to consider the person you're giving the gift to and not just rush out to the first shop and pick the first thing. So do we want to say to them, well, look, they've got good intentions, so that's all fine, or do we want to say they ought to have really thought about it a bit more carefully?
Well, it's actually even more complicated, because good intentions, and then you start thinking about it. Are they good intentions? In many instances they are, but again, the intentions themselves, to me, are more complicated and are messier than that. I think it's sort of, you know, an altruistic impulse can coexist with a narcissistic impulse. When people are doing something because they want to be seen as good, they want to be seen as charitable, they want to be seen as giving and engaged in that whole kind of project of common humanity. So I think it's even intentions themselves. That's why I sort of said earlier that giving is such a minefield. Even if you start digging through the intentions, it becomes much more complicated. And why give? Like, why give objects? If this is this the kind of the only language in which we can express empathy for people, you know, in the aftermath of a tragedy or a disaster? Why is that the kind of the language that is most commonly used? So
that's all very interesting. So Jane, just to get you to jump in here, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes I think the giving is about the person who's doing the giving relieving themselves of some burden, like that they're struggling with this disaster, so they go and do this action and then they move on in a way. They've done something, they've helped, it's a bit self-serving, but I think sometimes that is definitely part of it.
So do you think that only when they don't think adequately about it? So if we take Maria's example, if they had really thought, well, this is what these people need, they've asked for money, I'm going to give money, do you get to feel good about that? Or do you, if you feel good about it, are you basically saying that somehow it's really all about you and therefore you don't get any credits?
If you haven't thought through the consequence of what you're doing, it is about you. It's not so much about alleviating the real need that exists.
Yeah, okay. Now, you've got a specific story yourself. You were adopted in Melbourne in the 1960s, and that experience hasn't always been so easy for you. So can you give us a bit of background about that?
Well, to be honest, my story is a good story because I was adopted into a good home, had a very good upbringing, was a loving family, and had many opportunities. I think there are many people who don't have my story, who don't share this story. Also, when I turned 18, I went to find my natural mother, and that was a successful reunion. And then I met my father, and, you know, I have a relationship with two sets of parents, so I'm kind of blessed in a way. But I think there are a few issues. One was growing up in a family, you know, knowing you were adopted, and there were some identity challenges that I had, which is why I went to find my natural parents. Some feeling of not being quite right. And, you know, it led to some issues later in life, you know, trying to work out my place in the world, which were partially resolved once I met my birth parents. But I was going to say that actually it was when I had children myself that I really began to think much more deeply about what my mother went through at that point in time. And, you know, imagining having a baby and then, you know, giving birth and not being able to hold that child. And I think that's when I began to feel much more deeply about the issue. Because I could think about it for myself, and growing up and not feeling a bit odd, that was one thing, but, you know, to think of what my mother went through.
And you've had some interesting thoughts about the ethics of adoption as a result of that experience, because even though you're sort of, I mean, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think what I was getting from you was that you're a little bit uncomfortable with adoption, but you felt that everybody at the time was well-intentioned, so they meant well, even though, in fact, you're not so comfortable with the idea that adoption is the right thing.
Well, you know, we recently had the national apology, and Julia Gillard said, you know, that Australia is a great nation, but we also need to be a good nation, and she started really addressing the moral issues that surrounded adoption. So it's easy, like now we can look back and say, you know, it shouldn't have happened, but to judge what you were talking about before, judging the past by today's standards is a bit of a messy minefield. The people who coerced, forced, whatever, women who were unwed and pregnant to relinquish their children were doing so with good intentions, because it was very difficult for a woman to raise a child as a single mother in that time. It's a different world that we live in now. So I think that they thought they were doing the right thing. It's the same with the stolen generation and the racist kind of undertones of that, you know, they thought they were doing the right thing in their worldview.
But couldn't you argue in some ways they might have been contributing to that worldview? So by sort of solving the problem in the way that they were, are they culpable because they weren't trying to actually change the attitudes that have subsequently changed that made it so impossible for women to raise a child conceived out of marriage? Yeah,
it would have been nice if they'd been able to do that. But, you know, we're talking about people who, they were in religious institutions, you know, the whole point was these women were shamed, and it was all very hush-hush, and they were made to feel that, you know, they'd done the wrong thing, and you had to put the child in a good home, because clearly these women who were loose and got pregnant out of wedlock were not suitable parents. So,
what do you think, Tony? Do you think that people can be judged for those sorts of attitudes and the solutions they then came up with for them?
Well, we can certainly judge the whole thing now. in significant terms to say that what they did was wrong. In most cases, maybe there were some cases not, but most cases dreadfully wrong. Can you judge the people at the time from this perspective? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, I think sometimes the existing historical norms were so entrenched culturally that it's hard to see how some people could have got their way out of it, you know, so that demanding that they see the horrible consequences might be too much. But there were people at the time who criticised this sort of thing. It's not as though, you know, sometimes people make out, well, that's the culture of the past, they did all the things they thought were right, and that's the end of it. Not just for us, but it would have been the end of the thing. But as with the stolen generation, there were people at the time who objected to that. Not to mention the mothers themselves, of course, who objected to that. And the mothers in the case of the babies taken away too. And in the institutions, it must surely have been the case, particularly, say, religious institutions, but any institutions, that people had dulled themselves with respect to compassion. And compassion's a virtue right down the ages, you know. I mean, that's not a modern invention. So I think you can say, well, you can raise the question, well, couldn't they see that this was cruel? You know, then they had these other things going to block that out. Why didn't they take note of what other people said? Some minority voices at the time, but some voices. So even there's a bit of purchase for saying they should have done better, not just in terms that are available to us, but not to them. And of course, the fact that those terms are now available to us is extremely interesting, because I think it's an example of moral progress. You know, people sometimes talk as though if morality is a reasonable thing and objective in a certain way, then it must always have been the same all the time, and clearly it hasn't been. And one of the interesting things is that the history of the human race is a very stop-start kind of thing, but there's gradually been all sorts of important things come about through people at the time criticising and so on, other people seeing changes in conditions and so on. The emergence of a completely different set of attitudes to women and to women's rights and role and so on. It does seem to me to be a terribly important step forward in moral thinking, you know. Not that weren't people in the past who thought that and so on, but it certainly is one of the achievements, I think, of our time. There are many ways in which we've gone backwards, of course.
Yeah. So is what you're saying is we can think they were wrong, but we can't necessarily blame them because they were living in times where they didn't know they were wrong?
Yes. Well, there's not a lot of future in blaming them, I think, unless we're, you know, blaming and so on. I'm not a great one for blaming, but it can have a sort of functional point. It's helpful to illustrate what's wrong, to point out to someone that they're doing the wrong thing. Others will learn from that. You know, you learn yourself from it. But when they're dead and gone, it's rather hard to do that. But I don't think that means you should suspend judgment about whether what they did was wrong, nor even about, well, could they have known better? I mean, it's an interesting question. Could they have brought some of their existing moral concepts to bear on these things? I should say that Leslie warned me at the outset that if I got too abstract and philosophical, she'd pat me on the knee. So if you see Leslie stroking my leg...
That was supposed to be a private thing between the two of us.
You mustn't draw the wrong conclusions, especially not my wife, who's present here.
Okay, moving along. Tony, in your fantastic book, and you can see my hand is right where it belongs, you talk about former US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who in a movie that was about the Vietnam War called The Fog of War, he said something which I thought was quite interesting. He said, in order to do good, you must engage in evil.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
No. Is there another question?
No, I need you to unpack that one.
No.
So there you've got right intention, wrong deed, good consequence.
Yes. McNamara was admitting that the Vietnam War had gone completely wrong and that it was wrong in the first place, basically. And then he was trying to extricate himself from that situation. So he enunciated this thing about, what was it, to do good, you've got to do
He
evil.
says in order to do good, you must engage in evil.
Yes, and this is palpably false in general terms. I mean, very often you do good in all sorts of non-harmful ways. You don't engage in evil in his dramatic terms. What he was pointing to were certain very unusual, rare situations, and he was trying to pretend they were more common, in which it's been argued by some philosophers that you have to do the wrong thing and admit that it's the wrong thing in order to bring about some very great good or avoid some very great evil. This is sometimes called the problem of dirty hands. The example you mentioned in your introduction is connected with this, the city bombing, terror bombing, as it was rightly called.
The bombing of civilians in the Second World War.
Yes, by the Allied forces. I'm thinking of them particularly, since their cause was just. That was often excused, even argued to be right, by people who said, well, this was the only way to get victory, basically. And an American philosopher called Michael Walzer, who invented this term dirty hands to cover these cases, argues that utilitarians are wrong. These are philosophers who think that the only thing that counts for making something good are the consequences, because they would just straightforwardly say, okay, if they were the good consequences, then these horrible massacres of hundreds of thousands of mostly innocent civilians, I mean lots of them just children and so on, was the right thing to do. Walzer says, no, it was the wrong thing to do, but nonetheless you had to do it. The necessity of defeating Nazism and so on was too great. He calls this supreme emergency. Now, I've written a hell of a lot about this, and I won't bore you with it, but basically I'm very sceptical about the dirty hands thesis. There may be cases where it sort of makes sense. One case that I think is very interesting is I like real cases, if possible, for these things, is the case of some prisoners of the Nazis, some women and men, Jewish people, who escaped from one of the concentration camps. And one of the women had a small baby with her. And the pursuers caught up with them, and the baby began to cry. And she smothered the baby to death in order to escape.
That's actually quite a common war story. I've heard that in a number of different contexts.
I mean, sometimes these things are urban myths, of course, you know, but I think this was a real case, the one that I was in a book I read. Now, if you think she murdered the child, if that was the intentional killing of the baby, then it's clearly wrong. Killing the innocent is a wrong. But it was a wrong that was necessitated by this awful situation. And now, it's complicated by various things. I think, for instance, the baby would probably have been killed anyway, is one consideration. The other is that she was probably hoping the baby wouldn't die, that she was just smothering its screams and not trying to kill it, though she suspected that would be the outcome. That's the famous doctrine of double effect, which can sometimes be used here. But, so yeah.
Not the knee, but the elbow. Jane, do you think there's something in there of what you were speaking about before, about making ourselves feel better by saying, oh, it was wrong, but then just moving on to saying, but it was necessary? Does that go back to that kind of idea you were saying, that it's all about making ourselves feel better, that morality is really just about comforting ourselves because we want to feel that we're doing the right thing, regardless of whether it's the right thing?
I think that's far more extreme than giving a teddy bear.
I think that. I wondered a bit too whether both of you weren't a bit harsh on people wanting to feel good. I mean,
and if I can throw something else in there, then there is the problem of non-giving, the consequences of not giving.
Well, that's what I'm kind of trying to get at, which I think is what Tony's picking up too. I mean, is there really, if we do the right thing, is there anything wrong with feeling good about doing the right thing? What's the problem, Maria?
No, there is no problem. I think, to me, it's about being clear. To me, it's about, you know, someone used that term, and it was used in a sort of, in a way that I don't agree with, but there is something to that term which is called conspicuous compassion. You know, the kind of compassion that is, or the kind of empathy that requires a symphony, you know, violins and symphony orchestra and audience and stuff like that. I have a problem with that. I have no problem with people. We all feel so burdened by this world. We all feel so powerless. We are torn to shreds by what we see, you know, on our screens, what we read about in the newspapers. And if there is a way that we can find to feel that incredible burden lifted for a second, to feel for a second that it's okay to be us, to live in this crazy world, and we can reconcile with this world, and we can reconcile with our own morality, that's a great thing. It's a great kind of profound moral achievement to come momentarily into that place. To me, it's the question, the ethical question is about, you know, lying to ourselves. You know, not even to the world, forget the world, it doesn't matter. Lying to ourselves. About our intentions, about what we are after, you know, and saying that it's about the others when in some instances it's primarily about ourselves. And if it is about ourselves, and if we are clear about it, there's nothing wrong with that either. No. If we give to the person on the street because we feel terrible about the fact that it's cold, and we imagine this woman and maybe she has children, and you know, and we give, and we do not solve her problem, and we do not invite her into our home, and we do not, you know, look after her child for the next 20 years. So it's a momentary thing. It will inevitably be as much about us as it is about that person. But that's okay, because walking past that woman is much worse. Indifference is much worse. Explaining to ourselves that, oh, well, you know, giving to this person and this person will use it on drugs, and therefore I justify to myself my inaction, my indifference, my walking past. That, to me, in ethical terms, is a much greater evil.
There are different ways about things being about yourself, in other words. I mean, and there are some that, I mean, just connected with being a human being and being satisfied with what you do. But of course there are external things, about different things than that about yourself, like the guy who's basically cold-hearted and self-seeking, but beggar in the street as he's passing, and he notices that his boss is watching from the window up there. This will be a career-advancing move, and he gives the beggar $50, even though the beggar's only got coins in his bowl, and walks off. You know, palpably this motive is the wrong motive. This is doing the right thing. The beggar's finished up with $50. You know, looks pretty good, but for the wrong reason. This is an external reason. You know.
But some people feel that any kind of, I've certainly read, and I think it was your article, Maria, where you were saying that for some people, really the heart of what is truly a giving thing is not to give with any expectation that you ought to be recognised, that you should be doing it in a completely unostentatious way, or else in some ways you knock the kind of gloss off the giving just by trying to be noticed. I
mean, that's the ethical ideal of giving, right? That you give, and it's not, and it's very clear, it's inside of you, it's not something you put on, I give, but I expect nothing in return. You deeply, inside yourself, when no one is looking, in the darkness of your bedroom, expect absolutely nothing. And the act of giving is complete when you are giving. There's nothing else that needs to come back to you, not your own sense that you are a great human being and an ethical giant, not the great, you know, the smile on the face of the person whose life you saved, that you absolutely feel that the act is complete and the act that's all there is, that very act of giving. That's the ideal, you know, who can get there.
Exactly, but also the other thing I'm wondering about though, and Jane, I'll just bring you in here, isn't the counter-argument to that if we do give and we let other people know, so we pop our names, say, on the arch over the school to which we've donated a huge amount of money, that we're trying to actually set up a culture of giving, and we're actually setting an example and saying this is what you ought to do. If you have lots of money, you ought not to just keep it for yourself. And there are many Australians, as we know from the stats, who give nothing. They're very wealthy and they don't give any money, as far as we can tell, to charity or philanthropic causes. I mean, or maybe it's better to be out there so that we encourage others to also be giving.
It's a complex argument, because I do agree that by promoting giving and promoting the fact that you've given will in some ways promote other people you know to consider it. Maybe I should do it as well. Where I work, it's a not-for-profit organisation that has no government funding, and we rely totally on members of the public donating money. And honestly, whether they give it and they want their name somewhere, you know, we're happy to have the money to survive. We would prefer, you know, more people to give anonymously, but it's a difficult.
Why would you prefer that?
Well, because it's a more noble act. That's it's idealistic, I guess. But you know, the only thing giving I don't like is when people give with conditions. You know, they want something that you actually don't want, but they want to give you this money because there's something that they would like to see. And, you know, that sort of giving bothers me.
Will you get in trouble if I ask you for a specific example?
No, I can't think of a specific example, but sometimes people, like especially where I work, which is at the Holocaust Museum, and we live in a community and the people who built the centre are survivors, and they're very passionate about certain aspects of the story that might relate to, you know, their experience, and perhaps we haven't focused on it enough in the museum or, you know, in our education program. So it's not that they've
So in other words, they want to give money and then they want to say
support.
To you, and in exchange for that, we would like the exhibit to look more
like
like
a certain exhibition on a certain topic. And of course we consider, and we will do a lot of the things that they suggest, but not necessarily because we're being told to, because someone's given us money. We want to do it because it's what we want to do, and then hopefully people will give accordingly.
Yeah, you might want to distinguish between, well, you were both talking about ideals, and you might want to distinguish between saintly behaviour and ordinary good behaviour. Yeah. Because there's just a whiff of rather splendid Christian traditions going on in this discussion without being deliberately invoked. Cautions against the sin of pride, you know, the scriptural injunctions that, you know, you should be giving without being seen to give and so on. But for lots of ordinary people doing ordinary things, the fact that first they get some enjoyment out of it or satisfaction, secondly that they might actually get their name put up on a board at the art gallery or something, I can't see that as a really awful thing, you know. Maybe.
No, I don't think it's awful at all.
Well, can I just say, and I'm certainly not trying to be the judge of the jury, I should be the last person to be judging anyone, and I'm not. But you talk about the ordinary good behaviour. Well, I've seen a lot of ordinary good behaviour, and I've noticed that people who have the least give the most. People who have $1 will give that $1, and no one will be watching. And there will not be, you know, it would be a kind of an act of reciprocity that would just occur routinely without, and there is not a single, you know, if you do DNA, there is not a single Christian, you know, bone in me, yeah. So, and that kind of, and that rhetoric is completely alien to me as well. Yeah. So I think.
But it's the gospel parable of the widow's mite. I mean, there's this marvellous story about the rich man giving a whole lot of money, and the widow gives very little, but it's all she's got. And Christ says, you know, that she'll be rewarded in heaven, etc., or whatever. You know, this is clearly the better thing to do. And it's exactly what you were saying about the poor people giving more than you'll get out of a lot of the rich. I'm not accusing you of Christianity, I'm just saying.
And there is nothing wrong with that.
I'm just
Some
saying,
of my best friends are.
Good.
Absolutely, mine too.
I'm just saying it's in the culture, you know. These are things we've inherited in various ways, I think.
Well, in this conversation, I'm wondering if we're assuming too much agency on the part of individuals. So if you're not really in control of your destiny, can you be held accountable for moral or immoral decisions? So, Jane, you were telling me when we were getting ready for this forum, you were telling me about some Polish doctors who decided to make a systemic study of 150 people who were starving to death in the Warsaw Ghetto. And you were kind of contrasting that, because you're looking a bit blank, so I'm going to keep going. No. You were contrasting that with Mengele. So Dr. Mengele, as some people will know, was the sort of notorious Holocaust doctor who was experimenting on twins and experimenting on people. And there have been lots of interesting ethical discussions, which we can talk about if people would like, about the terrible sort of intentions that were behind the decisions to experiment on people, and obviously the terrible suffering that those experiments led to. But there was, some people argue, there could be a good outcome from those if we use the results of the studies. And other people say, well, because of the terrible things that were done to people and the terrible intentions behind them, the only thing we can do is take these studies, and some of them tell us things that we don't know in any other way. So my understanding is that, for instance, we know a lot about what it's like for people to freeze to death because of the terrible things that Nazis were doing in terms of these experiments. So what's the right thing to do? Let's start with that. What's the right thing to do with regard to these sorts of studies? Do we need to try to get a good consequence from them, given all the terrible that went into producing them? Or is the only right thing, because they were so such abominations, is the only right thing to say we shouldn't use those results at all?
I'm not sure of the medical facts of those experiments, because I think some of them were not really done in a rigorous way.
No.
But
I mean, the facts are that Mengele's experiments in particular were absolutely worthless. I mean,
they were worthless, Tony, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, it's an interesting debate even so, because he might have actually shown something, but I think in fact a lot of the stuff is not really worth anything. But
so
let's take the example as if it had.
And let's say, just for argument's sake, there have been many horrible things that are done in this world. So you've got somebody who's doing something for a terrible reason. He's caused terrible, he's got bad intentions. The deed itself is horrendous. And then you get the possibility of somehow redeeming it through using the results, the consequences, for some good.
So these people didn't suffer for no reason?
Yes, so the suffering didn't happen for no reason. I've often heard that as a justification. Do you buy that?
I'm not sure. I'd be interested to know what my colleague Stephanie Heller says. I work with a survivor, a survivor who was a twin, and her and her sister were experimented on by Mengele. So I'd love her here to answer that question. She and her sister, they had a lot of blood transfusions. I'm not sure what that part of the experiment was, but what was due to happen to her and her sister, who were about 19 years old at the time, was Mengele wanted her and her sister to mate with another set of twins to see whether they would have twins. Yeah, I mean, what could come of that anyway? But curious. Luckily for her,
the war, a statistically significant experiment.
That's exactly right. Luckily, the liberation happened before that experiment got underway. And
what do you think, Mia? Can you redeem? Because you've been talking about kind of things you're concerned about, where people are doing maybe the right thing for the wrong reasons, or the wrong things for the right reasons. Can you redeem an act that is so terrible because it's done for the wrong reasons, and it's a terrible thing to do, by somehow getting some good out of it in the end? Some good consequence?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm with Jane in as much that I think that's the question that needs to be asked of people who have a first-hand connection to that experience. I would not feel right to pronounce anything in relation to that.
But maybe that's a really good moral insight. I mean, maybe that is the answer, is if the people who have had the thing done to them that's so terrible, if they feel it would redeem their suffering, is that the right thing to do then, is to follow their leadership on that? And if they say no, then the right thing to do is not to, because they're the people who know if it's a redeemable thing.
I mean, I think if there are victims still around of medical experimentations and so on like that, then what they think about the idea of using the results, assuming the results to be useful, is a relevant consideration. I mean, I think that's something because they might find this deeply offensive and so on. But I'm not sure it's the only consideration, because if in fact extremely significant things were found out, which could then be built upon with, you know, harmless experiments and so on, that particular good outcome doesn't seem to me to be sanctifying the terrible things that were done. There's not, and I mean, you could make that very plain too in publications about the stuff. It's a desperately unfortunate thing that the information came about that way, but you can learn from all sorts of things, and you can learn from evil acts that have had accidentally good results of all sorts. I mean, should you just ignore the results of civil wars or dreadful invasions, like the invasion of Iraq seems to me to be? When you find this, that and the other has happened, which is quite a good thing, you might be able to learn something about that. Doesn't canonise the event. So I'm a bit that way inclined.
I wanted to just mention that what you started with was in the Warsaw Ghetto. Not many people know this, but in the Warsaw Ghetto, the population was starving. So the doctors in the ghetto, they had the patients that came into this particular hospital, that the only thing wrong with them after they examined them was a lack of nutrition. They decided to study hunger disease, and it's incredible what happened in a period of about 6 months. This highly trained group of doctors did incredible studies on the effects of starvation. And it's also a little bit unethical, because they were injecting these patients with iron, and they were trying to see what's the effect of this and what if we make them do this. They couldn't cure these people, because what these people needed was food, and especially the children. But they decided that, well, we're stuck here, we're imprisoned, we have no food, we have some medical equipment, and they produced these amazing reports that have been used long after the war.
These were Jewish doctors.
Yeah, Jewish doctors.
And the point, that was really the point I was trying to draw out, was that they didn't really have agency. They couldn't really do the one thing that really they needed to do. They were imprisoned, they were being oppressed, they couldn't provide food. So they tried to kind of make the best of that situation by doing something constructive. I mean, and to me it seems like there's something that when we think about our logic, our moral logic, usually what we assume is that people are in control of their destiny. They are able to make free choices, and then we can hold them accountable if we think the choice they made was a bad one. But these are sort of instances where people don't really have free choices, and so what ends up happening in terms of our capacity to judge them? Can we judge them at all?
Well, their range of choices are tremendously restricted by the circumstances, but they're not without freedom to choose, because, I mean, they chose to do this. They could have just stood there and died with the rest of them.
Well, they did die. A lot of them did die.
But the interesting question connected with that is, and you may know the answer to this, did they ask the consent of the people that they did these injections on? And
I don't think so.
No, they didn't.
And that's what I'm saying.
Well, that's a pretty
interesting.
critical question.
But I think, well, the results of this hunger disease study, I don't have as much of an issue as those being used, because it was the Jewish doctors trapped in this situation and trying to make the best of a very impossible scenario, as opposed to the Nazi doctors.
Oh, yeah, well, that's very different, yeah.
But isn't that even expecting consent, isn't that imposing kind of more modern day ideas? Because didn't our very ideas about consent and informed consent for research come out of the horrors of the Nazi experimentation?
That's right, but we do think that the era in which patient consent was totally disregarded by many medicos at any rate, we do think that was a bad thing. And I think that we can at least look at that then and say, well, it's understandable and excusable perhaps, but it's certainly a wrong that occurred in the situation, that these people they were treated as not really as fully human beings, I think, yes. But again, supposing the results that came out of it were, as you say, important and advanced various things, that doesn't necessarily excuse what they did, but I can't see that there's an argument to say that shouldn't be used.
Can I switch gears just a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit more about, so we've just talked about, one of the most extreme kind of moral abominations that there have been in the world, and I want to just downshift a little bit. And Tony, I wanted to ask you, because you bring this up in your book, you talk about this idea of moral integrity. And you talk about it in the context of party discipline. So I know that there will be other people who've wondered about this. Certainly it's something I've wondered about, is whether or not, so we often feel like our politicians are completely immoral or amoral, present company accepted, of course. But we can feel that way partly because of the constructs around them. So we know that they have to adhere to party discipline. And like I was saying, I've actually seen that myself, what that looks like. So how is it possible for a politician who has to do what they're told in terms of the party to have any kind of responsibility, personal autonomy to make choices, and therefore how can they exercise any moral how can they be moral? Because they can't make choices.
Yes. Well, we're talking basically about democratic politics in this context. And the circumstances and norms vary tremendously between different democratic countries.
Let's talk about Australia. So let's talk about our politicians.
Because I was thinking, there are plenty of cases in the United States where the idea of actually getting any discipline into the parties is almost impossible.
But our parties tend to be pretty disciplined.
But our parties do tend to be more disciplined. But, well, they still got choices. I mean, they can say, if we're talking about the party at large, parliamentarian members rather than cabinet members, which raises a slightly more complicated question, they can justify the whip and take the consequences. I mean, and...
so across the floor, you mean?
Yeah, or just not turn up. And conspicuously not turn up if they really feel very strongly about it. And similarly with cabinet ministers who are bound by even stricter constraints of cabinet solidarity, if they really think this is a deeply wrong measure, they can resign, Well, I think, as I say in the book, I think compromise is absolutely integral to any form of politics. So you don't want to have politicians who have such highly sensitive moral antenna that every issue that comes up for them is a do or die kind of moral issue. You've got to take certain perspectives. You've got to think, well, I think this is pretty bad. On the other hand, there's a real chance I can affect changes in this if I make it clear in the caucus, for instance, the party room, that I'm totally against this. But it isn't such a dreadful crime that I feel I've got to stop altogether. I have to postpone the achievement of the objectives I've got here and work hard to do something about it. If you find you can't get anywhere, I mean, sometimes people just keep delaying and delaying in this way, and then they do lose integrity, I think. But if they find that situation, then they should give up. They get out of it. But I mean, I thought it was quite interesting years ago in the Liberal Party that there were the Liberal wets or moderates or something, genuine Liberals, I think, who opposed a great deal of the treatment of refugees that the Howard government was putting into effect. They made very clear that they opposed that. There were only a handful of them. But they actually brought about various changes in the government's policy as a result of making it clear. whereas some of their other colleagues probably felt uncomfortable about it but wouldn't do anything about it. It's a judgment call.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, Marie and Jane, do you think that we have any, do you think it's impossible for us to respect them because we feel as if they can't make choices and be held accountable for them? Or do you feel like, you know, this is just part of party politics and why would we respect politicians anyway?
Jane?
Well, I mean, if you're part of a party, that's part of the consequence of being in a party, that you have to find that middle ground. If it's a die-in-the-ditch issue, well, I guess you would resign and then, you know, maybe become an independent and see what happens then on that case. But
and do you gain more respect for them when they cross the floor, or
yeah, you
that
would.
rare case where
you
they resign?
Would, but the
remember we were talking about one, weren't we? About Rob Borbidge.
Oh, yeah, Rob Borbidge, who stood up for the gun buyback scheme.
Do people remember this? So when John Howard first came in, there was the Port Arthur massacre, and then John Howard initiated a gun buyback scheme. This has all been back in the news because of what's been going on in the United States.
Yeah, and this Queensland politician supported it. And
he was on the
conservative,
conservative side of politics.
And, you know, he lost the next election, so he lost power as a result of his moral conscience. Is it better that he's in power, or is it better that he did what he thought was right? I think it's better that he did what he thought was right. I'm sure he sleeps better.
Yeah, but wouldn't he argue perhaps, and maybe Marie have some thoughts about this, wouldn't he argue maybe, I mean, obviously Borbidge not, because he made this decision to do something he knew was going to be unpopular, and then he took the consequence for it. But maybe other politicians would say, well, look, you know, the better thing is going to be for my party or me to be in power. I'll be able to be much more useful than out of power. So I can't really take a moral stand on this issue because it'll be the last stand I ever get to take.
Yeah, I mean, I find that it's so riveting and life-affirming when a politician crosses the floor in Australia. Yeah. I just like, all of a sudden, life
riveting
is worth
and life-affirming,
again.
that's big.
And this whole argument about changing the system from within and playing the game and waiting for your time, and that you know, that's why I'm not a politician, and for other reasons as well. But I could not have done that. Yeah. But I find, but those moments, those when you see someone just breaking ranks, my God, that's when. Then that's when it's good.
Let's go with that. Why does that thrill us so much, Tony? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, two things. I mean, first, I think we're impressed that there are people who really do live by their conscience, think hard about whether a thing's right or wrong, and then decide to stand against the crowd. I've always got plenty of time for conscientious objectors to warfare, even for those who object to a war that I think is a justified one, because it's an enormous decision to go to war and so on. And it's one that people ought to think in that kind of way about. Do I do this or don't I do this? So I think that's part of what's going on. The other thing is that, of course, how much you'll respect the person will depend a bit on whether they're right. Because, you know, I mean, people can get their conscience screwed up, and people can cross the floor and so on behalf of a bad cause. And we can still respect, in one sense, the fact that if they are, you know, genuinely conscientious about it, while at the same time being unhappy that they've done it because the actual issue is wrong. You know, that's one of the tricks about conscience. It can lead you astray, though it's utterly crucial that you should be conscientious. You know, so I think there's that much ambiguity in it. Actually, some of my best friends are politicians, I should say.
Always a good Australian conversation ends with us starting to bag on politicians.
Well, I think we should respect them a bit more, actually. I mean, I think the current crowd are pretty depressing, but you know, quite a lot of people go into politics, back to our theme, with very good intentions. And then things start to unravel. But some of them, you know, John Button was a politician I admired enormously, who did, you know, he worked the system and so on, but he spoke his mind on occasion when it was necessary and so on, and he worked for by and large, pretty good things most of the time.
Well, that kind of nicely leads us into, you know, the final thing I wanted to ask you about before I let the audience have a go, which is whether or not, you know, there is some essential nugget to something that we would call a moral act or a moral person. Is the essential nugget maybe that we always need to believe that they meant well, that they had good intentions, and then, okay, sometimes they're misguided. Sometimes they end up doing something inadvertently, like the teddy bear story, where it all kind of, you know, ends up going wrong. But it's hard to feel that someone or something is good if the reason or the intention or the motivation was bad. Is that the nugget of it, or is there something really? There's never one essential element to something we call moral.
Well, it's always fairly complex, but I do think there's a sort of nexus between the internal and the external in the assessment of good acts.
Oh my God, that was so academic. Do that again.
I always think there's something about the person, that was the internal bit, and about the quality of the act that they do, which interact in a certain kind of way, so that we can understand situations in which someone full of good intentions does what they see to be the right thing, but it's actually the wrong thing, as in the cases of the forced adoptions and so on. And we can respect the character of the person and their good intentions, not always, because they might have, you know, come to these good intentions in the wrong ways and so on, but generally there's an assessment of good character that we can make. And we hope that that'll flow into the act, and without the good character, the act begins to look peculiar, like my beggar case, you know, where the good character is not there at all, even though the guy's finished up with $50. So it is important to emphasise the intention, quality of intentions, but the quality of the action is very important too. We need to take into account the integration between sort of virtuous attitudes and dispositions and the correct outcome for them. So that, for instance, if we're talking about the things you were talking about to do with aid, it's very important that people, when they're really trying to deal with a situation of suffering and crisis, are acting knowledgeably as well as with good intentions. You know, they've got to have what the medievals call prudence. I mean, a prudent act is always very important. It doesn't mean selfish. It means, you know, paying attention to the circumstance. And there's a big debate connected with what you were saying, Maria, in the literature of overseas aid at the moment, particularly aid in crisis situations, which always, you know, it always seems terrific. I give money to Medicine Sans Frontières and these people because they seem to me to be doing terrific things. And the intention is very good. But it's turning out that an awful lot of moral complexity is involved in the field, you know. It turns out that sometimes people are doing what you were saying, inappropriate aid. They don't look to the situation on the ground carefully enough, and they bring the wrong kind of things. Other times, one of the most alarming things is that they bring medicines and food and so on into crisis situations, war-torn situations, and one of the parties in this thing forces them to pay bribes in order to get access to the place to deliver the aid. Those bribes are used to buy more weapons. These weapons exacerbate the situation. And so the actual bringing of the aid is a critical problem.
Can I jump in here, though, because you're raising something that's very important, which is I worry when you start talking about that, and when I've heard other people on radio start talking about all the problems that can come from my giving, because I give too. Yeah. And I worry that if much of what we hear is anxiety about giving, so all of these real complexities, but also, you know, that in one instance, somebody went off and bought a 2-hectare property, you know, in the country with all the money or an organisation where a lot of the money is ending up going to the administration rather than to actual giving, that will end up with people who will be able to say, you know what, giving, it's all just too hard. My money's not going to go to anything good anyway. I'm just going to keep it for myself. Maria, do you worry about that?
Yeah, and listening to Tony and listening to you, Leslie, I sort of want to reframe it a little bit and look at the other, very briefly, you will not even notice it, under a minute. Look at the sort of the other side, in a sense, at the, so if we push together these two maxims that exist in our culture, they have been in wide circulation for centuries, about the bad in the world. One maxim says, and I'll probably get it wrong, please help me, you know, for the evil to triumph, it's only necessary for good people to do nothing. Yeah. The other maxim says, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So one maxim tells us that most of the problems in the world come from the inaction of people, whether as individuals or in collectivities of various kinds, including that of a nation. The other maxim tells us that most problems in the world come from people doing things in the misguided belief, and most of these people are good people, some of those people are psychopaths, but in the misguided belief that they're doing something that is necessary and good and ethical and so forth. And the funny thing and tragic thing is that both of these things are true at the same time. That the bad in the world exists, and sort of prospers and so forth, simultaneously because of inaction, which is what you're talking about, people saying, look, this is too hard and my money is going to the broadband costs of, NGO compound, or the glossy brochures that will seek other donors and nothing is ever getting anyway, so I'll do nothing. So that's the sort of, inaction from a kind of moral paralysis. Inaction because it's too hard to confronting doesn't seem to do any good.
That's a great expression, moral paralysis.
Yeah. Or inaction because of indifference. That's another aspect. Yeah. But at the same time, good intentions, and we have, you've mentioned, we've talked about adoptions. We talked about, forced adoptions and the kinds of good intentions that many of those people were driven by. You can think about, the war on drugs and what that created. Again, good intentions. The war on terrorism that quadrupled the number of recruits to terrorism. And the more extreme examples, the country where I come from, where the workers' paradise was created on Earth, and millions of people were killed in the process of that creation, while those kind of, in the name of the idea, in the name of these great ideals, driven seemingly by something, aspiration of a utopian society, incredible evil is created. So it's really incredibly hard, isn't it? Because both that kind of moral paralysis and inaction, but also misguided action and the do-goodery. Do-gooders who just, they think they know. So that goes back to Tony's point about being informed and being knowledgeable and actually thinking of knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge as part of the ethical obligation.
I think that's an absolutely lovely place for us to just rest for the moment and allow the audience to come in. So obviously we haven't provided you with any pat answers, but probably as you've worked out, a lot of ethical conversations really are just about trying to ask some better questions. So I hope that we've given a little bit of food for that, and I'd like to now ask people if they want to ask questions. How is that going to work? Have we got microphones? Oh, we've got a microphone there. Okay, fantastic. So everyone can see the microphone down there? And also, sorry, I don't see the other one.
Yeah, there's one right
over there.
Yeah,
okay, so if you want to make your way down, if you've got a question to the microphone, hopefully we'll be able to, it'll all be tickety-boo and we'll hear you. Is it all working?
Is it working? Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, great.
Hi. Oh, sorry. So
go ahead.
I just firstly wanted to say what a very interesting conversation it was. And with regard to the giving, I agree with everything you all said, but I think that we didn't actually mention why it would be that people would be giving items rather than money. And one of the reasons for that is that the cost to themselves, or the perceived cost to themselves. If somebody is actually relieving themselves of a burden, as Jane mentioned, one of the burdens is that their house is so full of stuff that they're trying to get rid of. And suddenly, oh, an opportunity to get rid of my stuff. And so they haven't actually perceived that, okay, well, those people don't actually need that. What they need is money. So the perceived cost to them is not very great. I need to get rid of this stuff anyway. And another thing is, when people are volunteering physically, and I do a bit of volunteering myself, you tend to feel that people don't actually find that, people aren't that grateful for you volunteering your time. They'd much rather have your money. It always seems to be that they want your money rather than the fact that you're volunteering your time, which is money as well. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then I had a question that I wanted to ask Jane with regard to the fact that you said that you would rather people donate anonymously. Now, let's say that someone donates with their name rather than in a clandestine fashion where it all has to be anonymous, and they don't ask for a plaque or anything. They just want to be themselves donating some money. I just wonder about the very fact that if you say you don't wish to acknowledge the person's name, perhaps, or that you wish for them to be anonymous, are you perhaps jumping on a high horse, relieving yourselves of the chance to be grateful, putting yourself in a position where you don't have to be grateful because you think that it's your right to receive money?
Okay, that's a terrific question. Let's let Jane answer it.
It was probably misunderstood, because what I meant was, I think it's just a principle that the most noble way of giving is totally anonymously. In terms of the practical real world, I don't have a problem with it at all, that people give, and that we, because we always do, acknowledge and thank and recognise the people who do support our institution, and as a principle, I don't have a problem with it. So no, I just meant it's kind of a more biblical notion of, you know, the nobility of just giving. Just because you support something and you just give, it's a kind of idealistic view rather than practical. I have no problem with people giving and acknowledging them and thanking them. So,
did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about looking into the past and seeing great wrongs that have been done in the past, and we condemn them because we condemn them, we observe, we make observations because of our progress today. But how do we know that our progress is any more moral than the decisions they made then? Will not a future generation look upon our reactions and our organisation of our society as being morally wrong? We decry strong motivation in schools from a physical point of view, and the need to pass exams today. Will a future generation say, we've taught nothing of responsibility to our kids in our schools, and we've made them feel they are the most important, and a future generation will say, that attitude has destroyed a future generation. How do we know that we are right today? Is there not an objective morality which we must academically consider?
How do we know? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think that a very important point that's raised there is that when we look back at the past and on the wrongs that we, I think rightly think were done then, isn't it likely that in the future people will do the same thing to us? Yeah. I think it is, and I hope it is. I think when I was talking about moral progress, one of the things I didn't mean to do was to suggest that we are at the end point of it somehow or other. In fact, one of the interesting points in seeing where people were wrong in the past, without raving on against them, but finding it and thinking why, and working out, I would say objectively, why, is that we should be salutarily reminded that we're probably opaque to our own faults now in ways that people in the future will recognise. And that's a good lesson in humility, I think. But it shouldn't make us think that there's, second point, it shouldn't make us think that there's no right or wrong at all because of this, because there have been changes in the history of every form of intellectual operation. We don't think that mathematics is somehow just a matter of current cultural preference or something, because the mathematics of the past was different from the mathematics today, or the science of the past was different to the science of today. We look and see what can be salvaged from it, but we say, no, they got it wrong this way and that way. I think the same thing's true in a more complicated way about morality. So I disagree on the thing about we can't know because it's been changing. The fact that we can see these things helps us to know better now, which is true, I think, in every field of intellectual activity, not just ethics.
Well, so it's sort of like almost like you're saying ethics is like science. You know, it has to keep building on knowledge. Knowledge is cumulative, and so any truth that we have is sort of provisional. Do you agree with that?
I don't think it's entirely like science, but of course. But I mean, there's that analogy, yeah.
I'm looking forward to an apology in the future from our government for having to do cursive writing at school. So that one.
I don't think that's a moral issue.
Okay, well, look, can I? I think it's been a very.
Someone else.
Oh, we've got one more question. Good. I was thinking we were finished, so please give us our last question for the evening.
I think this is a fairly practical one. Tony, you mentioned you thought there was a Christian culture undercurrent here. I think there's also what I'd describe as a democracy or democratic undercurrent. We're taking that for granted. Democracy seems to have many faces and many forms, as I see it. It's a little personal. A year ago, I happened to be in the House of Representatives in Canberra the night the asylum seekers issue was being debated. I wasn't sure whether to cry or to chuck up. But the question, I guess, is this. The performance I saw that night from everyone in that chamber, our politicians, asked the question, is in fact party discipline, so-called, itself anti-democratic?
Well, this was, I take it this is partly directed at me.
I think that the Tony was the dead giveaway on that one.
I think it was.
I'd be interested also, I suppose, in from Maria's comment here too, having a different, perhaps, perspective too.
Well, for my part, I mean, this is one reason I said to Leslie before that there are democracies and democracies. There are very different ways of doing democracy throughout the world. Some of them are spurious, of course, various countries calling themselves democratic that are not. But there are similarly, within those different democracies, different attitudes to party discipline. And I think where party discipline is absolutely rigid, it is a bad thing for democracy. I think it's one of the few things that I sympathise with the Liberal Party about in the federal sphere, that they do take a rather tolerant attitude, at least verbally, to people crossing the floor and breaking the party discipline, where the Labor Party is absolutely ferocious about it. There's a sort of justification offered for the party discipline thing. You don't get the sort of disarray that you get in some other democracies where people are amazingly casual about their party allegiances, but that can be taken too far. And I think it often has been taken too far. And I think that I think myself that the attitude to refugees by both major parties is despicable, and will be one of the things that future civilisations will criticise us for. Indeed, current civilisations criticise us for.
Maria, do you want to answer, and then we'll wrap for the evening, I think?
Again, I'll try to be very quick. I grew up in the former Soviet Union. I grew up admiring dissent, believing that dissent is absolutely essential, necessary, and has to be at the centre of any public life. It has been, in some ways, a bitter disappointment for me to come to Australia and not to see the culture of dissent at the level that I expected to see it in a democratic society, having an idealised, of course, notion of a democratic society from within a totalitarian society. I don't quite understand. I've been in this country for over 20 years. I don't quite understand why the level of conformity in public life, in political life, within universities, in all other kinds of ways, in our media, is at the level that it is. No one has quite been able to explain that to me, and it remains an enduring question and a disappointment.
Okay. I have been told by the person who's the boss of this whole thing that I can take one more question, which is very exciting. Yeah. So you can have the last question.
Okay, thank you. I think, Maria, you said that one of the best reason to give or to volunteer is when you don't expect anything in return and it's completely selfless. I think from my experience, and I think a lot of people volunteer and give because they actually know that they will feel good afterwards, and because of that expectation, that is one of the reasons why they give, because it makes you feel good. Do you think that is that is a selfish reason, or is that an appropriate reason, just because you know that in return for giving or volunteering you will actually feel good or better about yourself? So that is one of the motivations that you have. It's not simply because you want to help someone else.
Sure, it's a great question. Do you have anyone in particular you want to answer?
No, just I want everyone's opinion.
Whoever's got the best answer.
To what I was saying, that people do it in a selfish way, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we're part of a community, and being involved some way, whether it's doing a good deed, volunteering. Where I work, I'm surrounded by volunteers, and they do it for themselves, but they do it for us. It's part of being in a community. It is one of the best ways to express, involvement in life. And what you're talking about in politics in Australia, I think it's partly to do with apathy. And I think when we're talking about good intentions and consequences, people, it's part of being involved. You're trying to do the best thing. Sometimes the consequences don't work out, but I think the worst thing is to be indifferent or to be apathetic. And, that's probably the worst thing.
Wow, that's a great way to end. I knew I was going to lose this battle. That's right. I knew I was going to lose this battle. Last comment.
Selfishness, I disagree with Jane on selfishness. I mean, self-respect is not the same as selfishness. And where people do things because this fits into their integrated character or improves their character in various ways, and they feel satisfied at that, that's not selfishness. Selfishness is a thing where you are pursuing your program and only for your gratification.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so I think we just need to be a bit careful.
Hear, hear. I actually agree with that. So, look, I think it was a fantastic evening. I think we worked through a lot of things and have at least some better ways to ask our questions. Can I please thank all of you, the audience, for coming out on this evening? Can I thank our speakers, Maria Tamark and Jane Josem and Tony Cody, and can we all thank them, please?